let's start. So, what is anxiety? Basically, they're worries, and they can be rational or irrational, and most of the time, anxiety has some sort of physical manifestation. And we need anxiety. Anxiety is important. If I didn't feel anxious about studying for a test, I wouldn't study for it. You know, if I didn't, so we do need some level of anxiety to function, because otherwise nothing would be accomplished. And there's this really interesting study that's pretty old. It's from Harvard, 1908, and they studied the relationship between anxiety and performance. And so what we see is that performance goes up to a certain extent with anxiety. So this is what allows us, this little slope is what allows us to focus, to be motivated, to work on things, to be able to make a three-point shot with a crowd screaming and yelling. So we always want to be on this side of the slope, but what happens is too much anxiety throws us off the edge. And what happens when we have too much anxiety is we get blocked. Our memory gets blocked, our learning capabilities get diminished, we forget things that we already know, and it's pretty miserable to be here. And our performance goes down. So when we think about kids, you know, that's what happens when a kid is studying for a test, they're really well prepared, they go in and they freeze. So part of what we're going to talk about today is how do we stay on this side of the slope, okay? So for those of you who have seen my talks before, I am a huge fan of Calvin and Hobbes, which also tells you about how old I am. This is a cartoon from the 90s. Yes, paper form Sunday newspapers. And I'm very attached to it. My mom used to cut them out every Sunday and send them to me in the mail to college. So Calvin is really a very anxious kid. He's very bright, but very anxious. He has an imaginary friend called Hobbes, and it's this stuffed animal, it's a tiger, and most of the cartoon is about him having conversations with Hobbes. But I'm gonna use him because he's a really good example of the things, of concepts of anxiety, so you'll be seeing more of him. Okay, so there's all different types of anxiety. And I'm gonna focus today on normal anxiety and not disorders. But if you have questions about anxiety disorders, we can talk about them. But I'm gonna try to focus on like normal anxiety, everyday anxiety. So you can have social anxiety in situations like parties or where you're meeting strangers. Separation anxiety, when you're getting dropped off at school at pre-K and you can't let go of your mom or your dad's neck. Academic anxiety, test anxiety, sports anxiety, when you're in a game and it's the last point and you're up to serve. Public speaking anxiety, which is what I usually experience in the first 5 minutes of a presentation. Anticipatory anxiety, catastrophizing, generalized anxiety, which means you just pretty much worry about everything, and other stuff like death and crime and relationships and college and finances. So this is an example of anticipatory anxiety, which all that means is you are worried about something that hasn't happened yet, but you think it's gonna happen, and the probability of that happening is pretty high. So good night, Hobbes. Good night. Do you believe in ghosts? And here we are up all night worrying about ghosts, okay? Catastrophizing. This is when you assume the consequences of something are worse than they actually are. And kids do this really well. So, oh my God, this library book was due 2 days ago. What will they do? Are they going to interrogate me, beat me up? Are they going to break my knees? Will I have to sign some sort of confession? They'll fine you 10 cents, now go return it. The way some of those librarians look at you, I naturally assume the consequences would be more dire. Funny story, Miss Wendy up there was my school librarian when I was in high school. And I don't know what she does, but she looks exactly the same. It's creepy. Okay. This is something that's really important for parents to understand. because you guys have adult eyes. And it's very hard for you to deal with worries that aren't rational. But worries don't have to be rational. Most of the time they're not. So when I take my bath, I always put my ducky first. For companionship, no, to test for sharks. So this is just an example that worries don't have to be rational. And a lot of times we spend energy arguing with our kids, trying them to be rational, when it's just anxiety. And anxiety distorts the way we think. So, as I mentioned earlier, anxiety has a lot of thought process behind it, but it also has a lot of physical symptoms. These can be pretty unpleasant, and they can include heart racing, knots in the throat, nausea, dizziness, stomach pain, sweating, headaches, feeling cold, weak, tingly, numbing of extremities, tearful, faint, breathless, butterflies in the stomach. And for people who have severe anxiety and may often experience panic attacks, the combination of all these symptoms can be so frightening that a lot of people end up, going to the emergency room thinking they're having some sort of, physical episode, heart attack, or that they are losing their mind. So when I work with kids, one of the first things I do is I try to explain to them what anxiety is. Can you guys hear me okay? Because I'm like in and out of the microphone. Okay. So this is what I tell kids to explain anxiety. So why do you get these physical symptoms? In evolutionary terms, anxiety is super helpful. It was designed for a reason. There is a part of your brain, the amygdala, that turns on when it thinks you're in danger. It's like a fierce warrior, and its job is to get you ready to run from danger or fight it. People call this fight or flight. The amygdala gives your body what it needs to be strong and powerful. It fills your body with oxygen, hormones, and adrenaline that you need to fight or run. It happens really quickly, so if there's something dangerous like a wild dog, then the amygdala is really helpful. But have you ever burned toast and set off a fire alarm? I've done that. The smoke detector can't tell between the two. The amygdala also can't tell between a wild dog and a new stool, because the amygdala was formed, it's a very primitive part of the brain. It's very old, so it's not very good at discriminating what is dangerous. Sometimes it switches on before you know why, and it's always working to protect you even when you don't need it. So if you don't need to fight or flee, which in modern day society, those instances are rare, when you actually have to run or fight somebody, then there's nothing to burn off all that fuel that's in your body. Oxygen, adrenaline, and hormones. It builds up, and that's why you feel like you do when you have anxiety. So when you're anxious, your breathing changes to fast little breaths. You start breathing from your upper chest, because oxygen gets sent to the muscles to be able to run or fight. If it's not used, that oxygen builds up, and that's why we can feel a little dizzy or confused. The fuel also gets sent to your arms and legs, and this makes your muscles feel tense. Your body cools by sweating so it doesn't overheat if you flight or flee, so this is why you feel sweaty. And the last part that happens is that your digestive system shuts down when you're anxious, because it needs to use that fuel to go to your arms and legs, and that's why your tummy hurts. So I give them a pretty biological explanation as to why they're feeling this way, because part of what we want kids is to become experts on their anxiety, and we want them to learn about their anxiety so that they can be better prepared to manage it. So I have to apologize, there's 2 slides in here that got ruined in the Mac PC transfer this morning. So you can't see them, but in the presentation that you get through email, you'll be able to see them. That's another thing that happened in addition to the dog throwing up this morning. So what happens in anxiety in kids? And these are just physical symptoms that we see. It can present as intense anger or sadness. A lot of kids who are very anxious are super irritable. They don't necessarily tell you I'm stressed out, especially the younger kids. They can't tell you how they're feeling, but they're grumpy. Physical complaints like headaches and stomach aches, a lot of trips to the school nurse saying their tummy hurts. Concentration problems, anxiety really interferes with their ability to concentrate. Sleep or eating problems, tantrums when you separate, even though these are normal, if it is at a very increased level or very severe level, it can indicate problems with anxiety. Extreme shyness, and I use the word extreme because I am not talking about personality. We have introverts and extroverts. Those are personality traits. Those traits don't change over the lifetime. There's nothing wrong with being an introvert, even though we live in a society that kind of values extroverts a little bit more. But, I mean, imagine a world of only extroverts. That would be a nightmare. And a world of only introverts would not be that much fun either. So we need both. So what I'm talking about is shyness that interferes with their ability to do things that they like to do. So if they want to invite kids over to their house for a play date, but they're too shy to do it, that may be an indicator of anxiety. And avoidance of situations is also an indicator of anxiety. If kids are, avoiding doing a lot of things that they would normally enjoy, that's also how it expresses itself. Am I going too fast? The pace good? I'm a little caffeinated this morning. Okay, so good. Okay, so there's two concepts in anxiety I want us to talk about, and we're going to talk about them in order. So first is, how do we deal with anxious moments? Those moments where we're having the physical symptoms, we don't feel so good, our thoughts are racing, versus overall anxiety. And what I mean by overall anxiety is kind of our baseline anxiety. When we wake up in the morning, how anxious are we in general? And those are two separate concepts. They're dealt with differently, but I'm going to start with the anxious moments first, okay? Okay, I'm going to get a little nerdy on you right now. That's because I'm a huge nerd, but so I'm going to give you the scientific explanation of how anxiety happens in these anxious moments. So you have a difficult situation, let's say a test. You get an emotional response, and emotions are one word. So it's like frustrated, angry, sad, in this case, anxious. That emotion is going to generate a bunch of thoughts. And those thoughts can either be distorted, because anxiety distorts our thoughts and the way we think about things, the same way depression does, or they can be accurate. So if they're accurate, it means I didn't read chapter 4, and the test is on chapter 4. So you're anxious because the thoughts that you're having that you're probably not going to do well on this test are based on reality. You didn't study for it. I had a kid in my office the other day. We went through a whole session of test anxiety reduction. The next day he comes back, it didn't work. And I was like, okay, well, let's walk me through it. What happened? Well, I did everything you told me. I worked on my thoughts, I did breathing exercises, I went into the test, and I was like, okay, hold on. But what happened the night before? And he's like, well, nothing. And I'm like, what do you mean nothing? He's like, I found out about the test that morning. And I was like, oh, honey. There is no strategy I can teach you to reduce your anxiety when you show up at a test that you found out about 5 minutes ago and you didn't study for. So that's not a distortion. That's accurate. Now sometimes, most of the time, what happens is that our thoughts get distorted. And that looks something like this. I will never get a good grade in this class. I'm just stupid in math. The teacher hates me. This test is too hard. No matter how much I study, I'm never going to do well. So the reason why it's important to know whether their thoughts are accurate or distorted is that we deal with them in a very different way. When they're accurate, what we do is problem solving, and we create some sort of action plan as to how we're going to deal with that situation differently so that it doesn't generate so much anxiety. But when the thoughts are distorted, we do something that's called cognitive restructuring. And that's just a fancy word to describe how we change our thoughts. And I'll go into it in a little bit of more detail. Anxiety distorts our thoughts in a few different ways. It tricks you into believing that you're incompetent, that you're foolish, that you're weak, and that you're stupid. It exaggerates and sees danger where none exists because it distorts our probabilities. You believe that a lot of terrible things are going to happen all at the same time. And if you talk about, if you talk to really anxious kids, they could write movie scripts like Independence Day and Contagion and those movies that like keep us up at night about all the possible things that could go wrong in the world. That's them. But one of the things that we work on is that having an anxious thought doesn't necessarily make it true. You can think an elevator is going to get stuck, but that doesn't mean it's going to get stuck. So these are kind of the things that I hear are, I can't do this, I will fail, something bad is about to happen, something will happen that I can't handle, I have no friends, I will make a fool out of myself, people think I'm stupid, I will never get into college. This I'm hearing a lot because my daughter is a junior. And oh my God, what about that SAT scandal? That's horrible. Anyways, I digress. No one likes me. I'm going to get sick and die. Another one that often happens is something's going to happen to my parents, especially with younger kids. So the goal with cognitive restructuring is to identify the distorted thoughts and correct them into accurate and realistic thoughts. And the key words here are accurate and realistic. Anxious kids hate positive thinking. It doesn't work for them. They don't trust it. They look at you like you have landed from a spaceship when you use those things. And the truth is that when I'm anxious and somebody's just like, oh, everything's gonna be okay. I look at it, I don't say these things because I try not to be rude most of the time, but it's like, it's not helpful. I don't buy it. It doesn't feel real to me. And most of the time I'm like, well, how do you know? And kids react the same way. So rule of thumb, if it doesn't work for you, it's not gonna work for your kids. So it's not positive thinking because they don't trust it. It's realistic thinking. And what does work is the power of logic and the power of probabilities. So you have a conversation with them about what is really true versus what are you afraid of what might happen. You talk about what the worst case scenario is, what the most likely scenario is, and what the best case scenario is. Most of the time, we're here. Every once in a while, the worst case scenario happens, but it's actually pretty rare. But if you have kids that are anxious, this is the most likely scenario. That's where they go. And part of it is reminding yourself that bad things don't happen very often, and if bad things happen, you'll get through it. And I know I'm covering this superficially. I'll go into more detail about this in a few minutes. So far, so good. Questions? You guys are awfully quiet. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to give you some examples here. A group of kids looking at her and laughing. This happens a lot. Distorted thought. Oh no, they're laughing at me. I must look stupid. The restructured thought is, they're probably laughing about something funny and I just walked by. I don't actually know that they were laughing at me. And if you notice, I'm not saying that they were laughing for sure. I'm saying most probably it's not about you. Because the moment that you tell them they're not laughing about you, they don't believe you. So you have to insert some sort of doubt into that anxious thought. Not being invited to a birthday party. She doesn't like me. I bet I'm the only one who didn't get invited in the whole class. Restructured thought. They probably just forgot Or maybe it was just a small party and I have other good friends. This isn't really very positive, but it's neutral, it's realistic. Getting a low grade on a quiz. I suck. I hear that so much in my office. I'm never going to do well in spelling. I don't know why I even try. Restructured. Well, I tried my hardest. It's only 1 grade. I will practice more next time. Okay? Am I making sense? Okay, with younger kids, I actually name their anxiety monster. I actually have this really ugly stuffed animal in my office that poor thing has gotten beaten up many, many times. But I take him out, they name him, because I really want them to see anxiety as something that's outside of themselves, that is, bullying them and mistreating them, and something that they can fight with and argue with. And I ask him, what is the monster telling you? What are the lies that he is telling you? With adolescents, I have little stuffed animals. They're kind of just hideous looking things, but they're not as cutesy as for the younger kids. But I also think about it as the worry bully and the worry alley. And it's the analogy of having something on your shoulder that's telling you things that are making you feel miserable, versus having something on your shoulder that's giving you some kind of encouragement and trying to make your life easier. Part of the reason why I talk about this is because what you want them to do is learn to talk back and argue with the monster. And you can say things, and this works better for younger kids. I don't believe you, that's a bunch of garbage, leave me alone, get lost, you lie, I'm not gonna listen to you anymore. And it's important that you say to them, this is a habit, these thoughts come back quickly, so you have to keep practicing and making sure that you are beating the bully the same way you would do by being assertive if you actually had a bully that you had to deal with. Okay, so we're back to this. So there's a difficult situation, you're anxious, your thoughts, you're accurate. So we talked about what happens when they're distorted. Now we're going to talk about what happens if you're accurate. What if the anxiety is not lying? Like the example of that kid who didn't study for the test. With real stressors, worries are not distorted, but a normal reaction. And you have to decide and help them decide if there's a distortion. Because sometimes, even if there's a real stressor, then you could have a combination of undistorted thoughts and distorted thoughts. If there's no distortion, you want to come up with an action plan. Is there something I can do to make the situation better? Is there something concrete I can do? If there's no solution, and a lot of times there's no solution, you have a kid with a chronic medical condition. You can manage the illness, but you can't make it completely go away. If your parents had decided to separate or divorce, that's there. It's not something that's going to change necessarily. If there's a death in the family, that's also not something that necessarily has a solution. Natural disasters doesn't have a solution either. So what you want to encourage is that the solution is acceptance. And within that acceptance, what are the things you can control and what are the things you can't control? And we'll talk a little bit about that later. With teens, God, they're fun.
Very fun.
I'm not being sarcastic, I actually really enjoy teens, except that I have 2 in my house that I don't necessarily enjoy all the time. I really enjoy other people's teens a lot more than I enjoy mine. But with teens, the distortions tend to be a little bit more complex. They tend to be a little bit more extreme, especially about social, romantic situations and the future. Everybody hates me, I'm hideous, nobody will ever like me, I will fail, I will not get into college. These are common things that anxious teens will express. The problem with teens, especially anxious teens, is that they are at high risk of self-medicating with marijuana or alcohol. And I spend a lot of time in my office talking about marijuana with teens because, we are moving towards, medical marijuana and legalization, and in some states, recreational, it's legal. The problem is that marijuana makes anxiety worse. And marijuana makes it worse in the long term, not in the moment. In the moment, it's like turning off a switch and you're not anxious anymore in the first 5 minutes. But the problem is that it enables avoidance, because since you're not anxious, you're not dealing with the things that you have to deal with. So for kids that are anxious, marijuana is a risky proposition. And of course, as most of you know, marijuana has a very big impact on developing brains. And I tell my kids, if you need to absolutely smoke, can you just wait till you're 21? Because the impact on your brain before 21 is significant. Once you hit 21, preferably 25 because your brain stops maturing at 25. We thought it was earlier, it's 25. Then the impact of marijuana is not that significant. So, with teens, anxiety is often fueled by bad habits such as caffeine intake. Caffeine has a huge impact on anxiety. Procrastination, sleep deprivation, avoidance, and perfectionism. And these are the things that, if you have kids who are struggling with anxiety or stress, that's where we target, because that's where most of the problems are. These behaviors and thoughts feed the anxiety monster, and there's this really cool app called Mind Shift that helps teens do the cognitive restructuring that we were talking about and correct the distorted thoughts. The app has like all these situations that you can identify, test anxiety, social situations that you can kind of decide how you're going to think about it. So it's a cool app. Okay, and this is one strategy that you can teach your kids in terms of dealing with anxiety. It's called STOP. Pay attention to the signs of anxiety, not just the thoughts, but the physical ones. Pay attention to the thoughts. Think of other helpful thoughts, accurate, realistic thoughts, and plan for next time. Okay, so I'm going to focus on some of the procrastination, and this doesn't apply to teens only. I mean, kids procrastinate from very early on, and us adults procrastinate too. So do you have an idea for your story yet? No? I'm waiting for inspiration. You can't just turn on creativity like a faucet. You have to be in the right mood. What mood is that? Last minute panic. So a lot of kids that struggle with anxiety say, I work better under pressure. A lot of adults that I work with anxiety say the same thing. But the truth is that procrastination is a really big obstacle for them, not only to be successful at school, but in terms of managing their anxiety. Doing schoolwork is already painful. Why make it more painful by doing it in a panic? And some tips here is to do the hardest thing first. When you get home from school, you do the thing that makes you the most anxious. So your to-do list is based on your anxiety. And what I'm looking for here is that if you do the hardest thing first, what I want is that relief of saying, oh, I'm done with that. The rest of the afternoon is going to be much easier. The other reason is that if you do the hardest thing first, your mind is fresher, you're more rested, and you're not doing the hardest thing at 11 o'clock at night when you are exhausted, which is going to make your anxiety worse. Electronics and procrastination. I gave a talk a few weeks ago about technology. I can't go into all that detail right now, but what I'm going to say about this is have your child do an experiment with electronics. You can't do the experiment for them because they will resist every single attempt of you to do that. But say, read that biology chapter with the phone on, with all the notifications, answer all the text, and time yourself. How long does it take you to read that biology chapter? Then ask them to read the biology chapter, another one, with the phone off. and subtract the time that they're actually texting or answering. And what you will find is that on average, kids, it takes them 30% longer to read the same chapter because they lose their train of thought, and by the time they get back to it, and that's excluding the amount of time they spent texting. This is actual reading time because of the lack of concentration associated with the electronics. So, and the thing is that if they don't discover that on their own, they won't implement it. So you telling them that this is true, it doesn't work. They actually have to do the experiment themselves. Before the talk, I was having a talk with somebody about all-nighters. All-nighters have become a status symbol. You know, like, oh, I pulled an all-nighter. Oh, I slept 2 hours last night only. And they compete about who is more sleep deprived. And the problem is that all-nighters have such a negative impact on your, like, you lose basically 3 days. You lose the night, you lose the next day because everything that was covered that day in school did not enter your system. And then you go to home and you fall asleep at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and then you didn't do the homework for that day either. And then you wake up the next day and you're really in a bind because now you are 2 days behind. In my case, when I was in college, I pulled 3 all-nighters the first semester. I got bronchitis within 48 hours of every single one of those all-nighters. And I mean, I grew up on a tropical island. It's not a big surprise that, you know, the cold and the sleep deprivation had that impact on my system. But then I lost 3 days of school and then I was sick as a dog. So it really is not the healthiest way to deal with things. And it also means that you're not very organized and you're procrastinating to the full extent. So not estimating time correctly is also something that's going to fuel anxiety. And again, I would go into experiment mode here, especially at the beginning of a semester with new teachers. Time yourself. Time yourself how long does that math homework take. Time yourself how long it takes you to read a chapter. Because kids are notorious, and adults, for underestimating the amount of time that things take. What they also do, which is not really healthy, is that they'll say, okay, well, it took me 2 hours to reach this chapter, so on Saturday, I'll read 4 chapters in 8 hours. It doesn't work that way. Because by chapter 2, you're bored, you're exhausted, you start reading at a slower rate, and there's no way that you can keep up that pace. And the other thing about procrastination is it doesn't give you any wiggle room. You can't run out of ink, and you can't assume that the lights aren't going to go out, and you can't assume that your internet's not going to ever go down. And when you're rushed and stressed, that's when all this happens. So you have to kind of give yourself some wiggle room in order to manage your anxiety. Study skills. One of the main reasons why I see kids struggling with anxiety is because they have not developed appropriate study skills for the grade that they're in, or they've moved into later grades and haven't adjusted the study skills that they learned in the earlier grades. Each grade requires you to up your game. You have to have new strategies and new skills every year in order to meet with the demands of school. And usually, breaking projects into long-term and short-term tasks is a challenge. A lot of times, this is about calendars. You know how the phone only has a calendar, like a day of the, like when you look at your phone and you look at the calendars, there's only one day. And if you go to the week, all you see are those little dots that are really not very helpful. So you need some sort of calendar that makes you see the whole week. You need to see what's happening on Friday. Because if you get into the habit of just doing the night before what you have for the next day, you're going to be in a panic a lot. Because especially by middle school, you have to be able to anticipate what is coming. And most of the time, you have to spend more than 1 day studying for a test. And that goes into learning to anticipate crunch times and anxiety's best friend, which is avoidance. Avoidance always makes anxiety worse. I think people worry too much about little things. All they do is make themselves unhappy that way. Why get an ulcer over things that don't really matter? Like the book report you're supposed to be writing now on the book you haven't read? Exactly, case in point. So, I mean, kids are really good about pushing stuff away and pretending that they're not there, but it usually comes back and bites them. Questions? Okay. So, I am a recovering perfectionist. And I say that fully. I wish some people would join me. We could form a support group. I grew up in a household that was pretty demanding. You know, I had a dad who, like, I would show up with a 99 and he'd be like, "Did you miss? What question did you miss?" And I'd show up with a 100. He's like, "What, no bonus points?" So, that was not the best way to, like, deal with my anxiety at that point, but it's really important that we are not sending a message of perfectionism. And a lot of times what happens is that parents are like, "Oh, we don't expect you to be perfect." And then they make a mistake and we eat them alive. So you're sending a mixed message, because if every time they make a mistake, you have a very, very strong reaction, it doesn't really matter what you say, your actions are speaking for you. So perfectionism fuels anxiety. It is associated and correlated highly with anxiety and depression. And the idea is that they don't compare themselves to other people, especially because that comparison is not fair. When you compare yourself to other people, you're always comparing your inside mess and chaos and all the things that you know about yourself that are not working really well, to the outside of people. And we're really good about pretending everything's okay. We're really good at faking it till we make it. You know, if you walk into a shopping mall, you know that there's a percentage of that people who are depressed and anxious. You can't tell. You can't pick them out. So the way I explain it to kids is, don't compare your inside to other people's outside. You will always lose. And encourage the concept of good enough. This is not encouraging being mediocre. It's saying there are moments in your school life where this is good enough. If you have 5 other homeworks, you can't spend 3 hours perfecting the drawing of the book report cover. And it has to be good enough. There are moments where you can be perfectionistic and you can put a lot of work into something. But given the time constraints, the concept of good enough is important. This applies to us as parents too. Okay, so are you guys familiar with the concept of mindfulness? Can I get a show of hands of who kind of knows a little bit about this? Okay, so the idea here is that you can't argue with every thought that you have. I mean, we have thousands and thousands of thoughts a day. So you can have thousands of anxious thoughts a day, and you can't necessarily go through that cognitive restructuring with every thought. So what mindfulness says is that there are some thoughts that we have to let go, and that thoughts are like waves. You know, think of the ocean. A wave comes and it goes away, and another wave comes and another one goes away. And our thoughts are like that. And you can't pay attention to every wave. The other analogy is cars. You can sit up by the window and look at all the cars go by. And maybe you can focus on 2 or 3 cars, but you can't focus on all the cars. So mindfulness teaches you, and I'm going to talk about this really briefly, but this is actually a really interesting subject, and there's also mindful parenting, which is a really cool concept too that I'm happy to talk about it at some other point. But if you think about your thoughts as waves and you observe your thoughts, and then you decide which thoughts are really distressing you, which ones do you analyze, and which ones do you let go. And the idea is that anxiety lives in the past, and in the future. Most of your anxious thoughts are about things that aren't happening right now. So mindfulness kind of trains you and makes you practice staying in the present so that your anxiety doesn't get increased by future thoughts or past thoughts. And every time your mind wanders into the future, you bring it back. That takes practice. It's hard, but it is pretty rewarding. And the way you do that is you focus on your 5 senses. So for example, if you're washing dishes, then you are focusing on the water, the smell of the soap, the motion of washing the dishes. You're not thinking about the 50 emails you have to answer. You're not thinking that after you wash the dishes, you have to go read bedside stories. You're not thinking about the fact that you haven't done the laundry or folded it. You're not thinking about, answering that conference call. You're not thinking about tomorrow's meeting. You're just focused on washing dishes. And you're staying present. And it doesn't take more time. It just makes you enjoy what you're doing in the moment a lot more. So if you're reading a bedtime story, you're just reading a bedtime story. You're not thinking about the emails and the conference call. You're there. You're present with your child or with your partner. And it's also being non-judgmental about your thoughts, because the thought about whether there's a tsunami coming has the same weight at that point than what you're having for breakfast. Because you're not in a tsunami right now. And it's creating distance from the disturbing thoughts because you're observing them. And it's also understanding your anxiety, because some people have themes, And I use the tsunami example because I have a patient that every time she gets anxious, she goes on tsunami mode. And she knows it's irrational, and she's like, there hasn't been a tsunami since, I think it's 1906 in Mayagüez, just so you know, because we talked a lot about tsunamis. But every time she gets anxious, she thinks about tsunamis. And now, every time she thinks about tsunamis, she says, I must be anxious. What do I need to do to lower my anxiety levels? Instead of, what is the next emergency plan I'm going to create to deal with the tsunami? And the other concept that's really important in mindfulness is that my thoughts do not define me. I can feel like a loser and not be a loser. I can feel dumb and not be dumb. And the best example is, Christy, stand up a second. I didn't warn her about this. Okay. You're a car. I'm not a car. You're a car. You're a car. You're a car.
I am not a car.
I can tell Christy she's a car till I'm blue in the face. She's not going to turn into a car. The thought that I'm having that I want her to be a car doesn't make it true. And kids really understand this because it's very concrete. Just because you think it doesn't make it true. And just because somebody says it to you doesn't make it true. And if she had turned into a car, we'd have a whole different set of problems right now. So in summary, it's a way to quiet the mind. And we have Calvin, who was so ahead of his times. He was talking about mindfulness in the 90s. We're so busy watching out for what's just ahead of us that we don't take the time to enjoy where we are. Okay, so what can parents do in anxiety moments? So this is tips for you. Notice out loud. It seems you're thinking upset about that test. Part of what we need to do with younger kids is they need to learn to identify their emotions. And you are a very important step in doing that because you're with them most of the time. For little kids, you can put an emoji on it. You can show them the phone and say, which of the emojis are you feeling right now? And use emotion words such as frustrated, angry, sad, anxious, and stressed. You have to normalize anxiety too. And you can say that by most people feel anxious before a test. I remember feeling like that when I took tests. What we usually do is, oh, don't worry about it, you'll be fine. That doesn't help. Listen and take the time to hear the story or rationale. A few years back, when my daughter was like in 5th or 6th grade, we had one of those class parties and she was in charge of dealing with all the money, right? So at the end of the night, we had all the money in this like silver box. And we're walking towards the car, and of course, because this happens all the time in my life, she trips, the box went flying, there was money, I can't even tell you, there's money everywhere. Of course, they were all $1 bills, because of course. And the biggest puddle you've ever seen, all the money in the puddle, everything's wet. We spent like, I don't know how long picking up all this money. And she had a full meltdown. And I couldn't understand why she was so upset. So I was like, I don't understand, what's going on? And I finally realized after talking with her is that she thought that when money was wet, it was ruined. She thought she had lost all the money of the activity because she thought that you couldn't dry money and that she had lost all of it. And so by asking her questions about why she was so upset, I could figure out which made sense given her reaction. So what is making you feel scared? What are you worried will happen? What bad thing do you expect to happen in this situation is a way to getting at those fears. This is really important. You need to comment on the thoughts and just mirror back to them what they're feeling. That sounds tough. That sucks. Just the acknowledgement that they're going through a hard time is often extremely powerful for them. And what you're doing is you're validating the emotion. You're not feeding it. You're not giving it power. You're just acknowledging that it's there. Because otherwise, if you don't say it's okay for them to feel that way in that moment, you're saying you shouldn't feel that way. So how many people have had a friend, partner, kids say to you, you shouldn't be mad about that? How does that go? Does that make you less mad? No, it makes you more mad. Because it would have been much better if somebody said, I know you're mad about that, but you're not allowed to throw that. And that's the same with kids. They need an acknowledgement that the emotional experience that they're having is valid and real. Stay calm when they're anxious. I know this is really hard, but you are the model of behavior for them. So if they see you freaking out, they're gonna freak out. And encourage them to tolerate the anxiety, that they don't run away from it. So if they're really anxious about making the serve, encourage them to kind of stick with it and work through that anxiety and not quit the situations that make them stressed out. Help them brainstorm of things to do, make a plan. It's really important that they create the plan because otherwise they're not going to implement it. They have to be part of the solution. Breathing exercises. Christy's going to demonstrate this. There's an app called Calm that helps you learn how to breathe too, but Christy's getting certified in mindfulness, so she's going to be our resident expert on mindfulness, and she's going to give us a breathing exercise.
I'm just going to be giving you a breathing exercise. So we're going to do an experiment right now, and I want you to breathe for 1 minute. And then you're going to count the times that you breathe in 1 minute. It's very simple. So a breath is an inhale and an exhale. And that's just for 1 minute. I'm going to count you. Regular breathing. Regular breathing. Regular breathing. How you're breathing. So I'm just going to count them. You're just going to count the breathing. I'm going to count them myself. Use your fingers. That helps. Okay? So ready? We're going to start right now. Stop. Okay, I want to hear numbers. ¿Cuánto? 6. 11. Numbers. 10. 12. 18. Okay. 11. 15. 15. Numbers higher than 15. 18. 22. Okay. ¿Cuánto? 24. Okay. 23. Okay, so most people breathe about 14 to 18 breaths per minute. Okay? So that's like your normal breathing rate. So that's normal. If everybody has different rates, that's perfect. You're perfect. Everybody's perfect where you are. So what you want to count down, you want to breathe about 4 to 5 breaths per minute. So that's the ideal number of breaths that you do to calm yourself down. Okay? So whatever number you have, because sometimes you have different numbers at different rates in the day. When you're anxious, you probably have, probably Alex right now, or maybe when she started the talk, she's probably having...
I think I've had 45 the whole last 45 minutes.
Okay, 45. So what you want is to control that breath, and the way to control it is to practice every day. So as Alex said, there are many apps right now that you can find in your phone that can help you with that. Do you want me to practice a practice breath? So the ideal breath to calm you down is you breathe into your abdomen, your diaphragm, your belly. So when you breathe, okay, you're going to inhale, and you're going to imagine that you're inflating a balloon. For some people, this may sound like contrary to what they do normally. Okay, and that's totally normal, because when you see a baby, they usually breathe normally, but somewhere we lose that. Okay? So when you breathe in, you feel your belly comes up, and then when you breathe out. So you can practice that and on your own, right? Because we don't have the time today, so.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you. And with kids, the way I teach it is you put a hand on your chest and a hand on your belly button, because they need like that physical reminder, and they have to breathe 5 seconds out and 5 seconds in, and their belly button has to move with each breath, because then you know that the breath is getting down deep enough. And this is part of the brainstorming strategies that you can come up with them, what they can do when they're feeling stressed out or anxious. They can also write down their worries. This works really well at night, right before they go to bed, and their mind is racing, they're having a bunch of thoughts. They can sit down and just kind of vent on paper, and that usually calms the mind enough for them to get back to sleep. And the things we talked about, which is, are there other ways of thinking about the situation? What's the new plan of action? But after you come up with a plan of action, you need a distraction, because you need to get them to change the channel. And I lost my clicker. Oh, here we go. So the distractions are the obvious ones. Physical activity, which is a natural anti-anxiolytic. It reduces anxiety naturally. Focus the brain on another activity like music, books, games, playing with a pet, my personal favorite, or visualize a happy place. This is my happy place. For us who live here, we're so lucky that we live here, that our happy place can be 5 minutes away. My husband says that there's a corona missing from this picture. But humor, watching a funny movie, getting them to laugh about something, looking at those funny memes, getting them outside. Kids really need to be outside. We really need to be outside.
But what when they only want to play Xbox? They don't want any other distractions, so they're going to play Xbox.
Well, you set it up so after you're outside for 30 minutes, then you can play with your Xbox. So you make it contingent, that they win that privilege after they have exercised or gone outside. What doesn't work? These are the sentences that drive kids bonkers. They roll their eyes at you, and then they tell you, they don't come back to you when they're stressed, because it's frustrating for them to hear these things. Don't worry, that's not gonna happen. Just relax, just think positive. You don't have any real problems, why are you stressing? Don't be so dramatic. You shouldn't feel that way. This is such a little thing, why are you stressing? You're making this bigger in your head than it really is. Just be brave, you gotta be more brave. Or making fun of their fears. You know, my daughter for a long time had a fear of fish. It was really hard not to make fun of that. Thankfully, she's past it. I mean, but it's not a good thing. Don't make fun of their fears. And just be there. Sometimes they don't want to talk, but they don't want to be alone. Sometimes they just need comfort. Just being in the same room can be comforting. Sometimes they need to be alone. Give them that space. Be patient. Resist the urge to fix every problem. Focus on them developing problem skills. We want our kids not to suffer and not to experience negative emotions, but they have to. They have to learn how to manage them. Other things that can make anxiety worse is electronics, like somebody mentioned. The problem with electronics is that they foster avoidance, because if they don't feel good, they can escape into a world. They don't learn how to deal with boredom, they don't learn how to deal with sadness, they don't learn how to deal with stress, and they're not learning to cope with those negative emotions because they have a place that is very engrossing, very rewarding, but they're not coping with things. And this is the same thing that happens with marijuana. When you look at kids who have started smoking marijuana at 14 regularly, and you look at them at 24, they have the emotional coping skills of a 14-year-old because they haven't learned how to deal with their emotions. What can also make anxiety worse is unrealistic praise. You know, I had a kid in my office the other day, and she was in tears. Her mom and her dad kept saying she had so much potential, she's so gifted, she's such a genius, she's so wonderful. And instead of that feeling uplifting, it just felt like pressure. Like I mentioned before, not developing study skills, managing time, managing stress. And for us, when we parent out of fear, if our fear is dominating all of our decisions, then it's your anxiety that you're not being able to tolerate, and you're not letting them experience the ups and downs that they need to experience in order to be able to cope with life. Another thing that makes anxiety worse is not enough rest and not enough play. Kids need breaks, and those are not extracurriculars. You know, the break is not the soccer practice. The break is coming home and having 30 minutes of doing nothing. What does help? Looking at stress as an ally, because stress means that you need to focus on something. It's a message that your brain is sending that you're not dealing with something. And overestimating the difficulty and underestimating your ability to deal with it is part of what generates stress. Your empathy towards their situation makes a world of difference in terms of their stress levels. You being able to say, you seem really stressed out. It seems like you're having a hard week. And the last concept I'm going to talk about, which is faith in competence and coping. So I hear this all the time. Yo no puedo bregar. You guys know what that means in English? I can't deal. And now you have two problems. The problem that you think you can't deal with, and the fact that you can't deal with it. So what we want to send our kids is the message that failure, rejection, and disappointment are normal parts of life. That if you try to create a stress-free life for your kids, what you're saying to them is, I don't think you can handle it. You're sending a message of fragility. You're sending a message of incompetence. You're not saying, I think you can handle this. You're saying, I'm going to take you out of this situation because I know you can't handle this. So you can't eliminate anxiety. You can only manage it. And our role is really to be guides, not protectors. We guide them through the ups and downs, but we don't necessarily protect them. There's this new term called the lawnmower parents. So now we're lawnmowers and helicopters. But the lawnmower parent, what he does is, or she does, is they cut all the grass so that nobody stumbles. And they eliminate all the pebbles. so that they don't get hurt. And how do we reduce overall baseline anxiety is routines are really important. You avoid overscheduling, especially in January and August. You modify expectations during stressful periods. You plan for transitions. You allow extra time in the morning to get to school. My son takes an hour and a half to brush his teeth, put his uniform on. He doesn't comb his hair. And have breakfast. 3 things. Takes him an hour and 15 minutes. And it's the only way my mornings run smoothly. If I wake him up an hour before, it's not good. Watch your caffeine and sugar intake and the importance of sleep. Sleep helps us regulate emotions. It is the #1 thing that helps us regulate emotions, including stress and anxiety. And these are the hours that kids need to be sleeping. I know. This is based on research. I didn't make this up. I know none of the kids in this universe are sleeping this much, but this is what is recommended for them to handle their stress. Be a calm example in daily life. And this is just a cartoon that illustrates my morning today. And I think we can all really relate to this, the chaos. And be careful about your anxiety contamination. When my son was really little, he had this book report that he had to present in front of the public. And I said, "Oh, Diego, are you worried about your oral report?" He's like, "No, should I be?" And I was like, "Oh, darn it, I'm not winning any parenting awards today." I totally contaminated him with my anxiety. I reinforced the fears. So you're sending them a message that the world is a really scary place, and that makes them anxious. And the last thing is you've got to limit their exposure to media, to the news. They are paying attention. They're listening. They're looking for it online. And this is my last Calvin and Hobbes. I think we need to get that kid to a psychologist. He's making a car scene with Snowden. So the goal is a kid who knows how to roll with life's ups and downs, put feelings into words, calm down when needed, and bounce back and try again. So that's it. Questions?
I was just going to ask if you can post this on the website.
Yes.
Website?
Yes, and I can provide it in Spanish too.
Thank you.
Yeah, so and if you can either email me and I can send it to you. Christy and I have a Facebook something, I don't know what we call it. We make little videos on parenting, so feel free to check them out. Any other questions?
As a mom of a 9th grader, it's like a 4-year sprint to college, and then you have to have above a 4.0, and everything has to be perfect, and you have to have 100 hours of everything. Yeah. So how do we have our kids? It's stressful already. My son asked, "Well, what can I take to help me sleep?" I'm like, "Oh my God, I can't." So what can we do to make this not a sprint?
I think that's the answer to your question. I don't know what happened to this thing. Oh, it's working again. The $10,000 question. They got to figure out a system that works for them, and they got to find a balance that allows them to sleep enough and that allows them to do well enough. Sometimes, I'll tell you what the common problems are. Procrastination. If they can't get a handle on their procrastination, they're not going to be studying effectively. A lot of kids study too much because they feel really insecure that they don't know the material. So you got to be watching out for that they're not overstudying because they're anxious and then they study too much. You also have to be watching as to what time they're going to bed. 47% of kids do not turn off their phones' notification sounds at night, and it continuously wakes them up. So I would be looking at all the areas. I'd be looking at sleep, I'd be looking at food, They might have to choose to eliminate certain extracurriculars. I mean, that is a choice that every high schooler has to make in terms of what sport, what they're going to focus on, and they have to have a game plan that works for them. The thing is that your son's game plan is not going to be the same game plan as somebody else. And you guys as a family need to figure out what is the balance that your family needs in order to function well. And if that means family dinners, or if that means Sunday at the beach, then you need to be able to schedule that in.
But I think that what you said was that he was having trouble falling asleep. Yes. Falling asleep.
So falling asleep, I would look into the sleep hygiene literature, which is that you create a bedtime ritual that allows you to fall asleep. That includes an hour before going to bed, you have to eliminate electronics because the blue light interferes with the production of melatonin. And so that makes it harder for them to fall asleep. Teenagers, the melatonin production starts at 10:30 at night. That's why it's so hard for them to fall asleep before midnight. For us adults, it starts at 7:30. So that's why at 9:30, we're done. I'm done. And so, it's really hard because our schedules, our bodily schedules are on a different track as theirs. But they need to figure out a way that really helps them fall asleep. And a lot of kids think that you should just close your eyes and fall asleep. Your brain is like a fan. When you turn off the fan, it still rotates until it falls asleep. So you need to give enough time for the fan to stop rotating, and that's usually an hour in order for them to fall asleep.
I just wanted to ask if you would implement these strategies that you shared for social anxieties as well as school stresses and homework.
Yeah, absolutely. With social anxiety, social anxiety is very common at middle school and high school level. So, there's part of that that's really normal. And what you want to do is gradually expose them to the things that they're afraid of doing. So, for example, if they have a hard time going to a party, then what are the strategies for them to show up at the party with somebody and ask them to just stay for half an hour. And if they tolerate it, then that's fine. And the next party, you stay for an hour. And prepare them to what conversations they can have. They might have some topics that they want to start conversations with for people. They need to practice that. But they also have to fight with all those thoughts in their head. Remember the worry bully? That some of those thoughts were about social anxiety. Some of those thoughts were, people are not going to like me. People are going to think I'm stupid. People are going to think that what I talk about is ridiculous. So they need to practice and learn how to fight those thoughts before they're in the situation. Because if they're in the situation having all those thoughts, they're not listening. And they're not engaged in the social situation. And then that interferes with their performance on that situation. So I'm giving you like a 30-second answer to a really complicated problem, but it really is about designing a plan that's gradual. You can't expect them to kind of jump in and dance in front of the whole class at the next party. You have to set it up so that they feel like they're making progress, but it's gradual enough that they can be successful at it. Any other questions? Yeah.
So my question is, you listed electronics and some of these other things as inappropriate avoidance techniques for anxiety. So I have kids that don't so much avoid with technology, but with like books especially. And I recognize that tendency in myself as well. Is that also unhealthy, or are any avoidance techniques unhealthy?
Well, it depends if they're not being able to complete their tasks. So if they're reading Harry Potter instead of studying for the test that they have the next day, well, yeah, it's that they're avoiding the test. So it's not that you eliminate it, but you set it up as the same reward as you would with an electronic. You say, you can read after you're done with your work, or you can read this amount of time, or it can be their break, if that's the break that they want, but then you have to set up a time limit for it. Oh, sorry, we have hungry people outside. Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you.